we kind of decide a lot about what happens to animals. I mean, things will happen and evolve their own way as well, but humans have so much of an input that if you don't kind of talk to politicians, talk to the funders and those kind of people, it just wouldn't work without human collaboration. I wanted to be able to give a microphone to that voice and let the people who were actually being impacted the most have an ability to have a say on what happens in their surroundings. It's not just humans doing things for nature for the sake of protecting nature, but that humans need nature.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Resilience Tracks, the podcast where we follow the tracks of the next generation of environmental leaders working to build a more resilient future here on Earth. I'm your host, Stephanie, and today we are joined by Eleanor Salisbury. Eleanor is a master student for endangered species recovery and conservation with experience in animal husbandry, animal behavioral research, social science research, and science communication. During her TNC and Nat Geo Society externship, she focused on beaver reintroduction in the UK, which then turned into a 30-minute documentary on the topic. And outside of filming, she also studies human-leopard coexistence in South Africa, surveying wildlife estate residents on their perception, attitudes, and behaviors living alongside leopards. So today, we will delve into Eleanor's story, researching, and storytelling for wildlife conservation. Hello, Eleanor. Welcome to the podcast today.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. I guess to begin the story, a very simple question, kind of what brought you into the realm of conservation? How did you get into this field and start becoming interested?
So I grew up in Hong Kong, and I was lucky enough to actually grow up I had the beach in front of me and the mountains at the back of me, basically. And so I think a lot of people think of Hong Kong as quite a metropolis city kind of place, and they're not wrong for some parts of it, but there's a lot of countryside in Hong Kong too. I think about 70% of Hong Kong actually is countryside, because it's quite hard to build on it. It's quite a mountainous area and stuff. And so I was lucky enough to live near the countryside. So I got to be around nature a lot. I saw that a lot of my friends, the ones who grew up in the more urban areas, didn't have this access to nature as much, so they didn't have the same appreciation that I did. So throughout school, I liked nature and I'd bring my friends out into nature, but there wasn't really a path in school into conservation or animals and stuff. I liked biology the most because that was what was connecting me towards nature. Also grew up with a lot of the David Attenborough documentaries and that kind of thing. Hong Kong itself has wildlife, but as a kid, I don't think I noticed a lot of it. And I remember coming to England as a kid, seeing my grandparents and being like, oh my gosh, there's so much wildlife here. After now, I've gone to South Africa and realized, wow, the comparison is stark. But yeah, so I just kind of always loved animals since I was a kid. I volunteered at dog shelters, that kind of thing. And I think originally I thought I wanted to be a zookeeper or a dog trainer because those were the kind of two paths that I saw. David Attenborough had those documentaries, but I was like, that's not going to be me. I don't understand how that happens. And so for me, it was I can be part of a zoo or I can do dogs. Those are like the paths I thought. And then went into zoo biology. I loved learning about animals, loved that I was finally doing what I wanted. But when I got into my placement and started working kind of as a zookeeper, I kind of felt like this wasn't enough. And what I liked was kind of the research aspect and conserving wildlife. And whilst I enjoyed what zoos could do for that aspect, the idea of just kind of like feeding and cleaning animals wasn't what I wanted from my life. I still enjoyed it, but I just enjoyed my research project a lot more, essentially. So wanted to get into conservation and wildlife conservation. Yeah.
Okay, and then jumping from your master's and going more into the research side of things, how did you kind of land on, I guess we're starting a bit backwards than I was initially planning, but we'll start with the leopard conservation research, I think. How did you land on that topic?
So on my master's, I was looking for something that I wanted it I wanted it to matter essentially because in my bachelor's, I chose a research project which still mattered, but it was in a captive zoo environment,
Mm,
and it was very animal behavior focused, which I loved. But I cared a lot about human wildlife coexistence. In Hong Kong, for example, we have wild boar, and they lived in the mountains behind me, so I saw them quite often. And there was a bit of this human wildlife conflict aspect because they would get into the rubbish and stuff like that. And some people, could get hurt by them. And so I was always interested in human wildlife coexistence and how humans and nature can live alongside each other. And I had a lot of knowledge with animal behavior, but I recognized that if I wanted to work in human wildlife coexistence, and this was through this documentary, this externship as well, that I had to learn about humans, not only animals. So I chose something a bit more social sciencey, or I wanted that experience at least. And the advertisement of an internship working with human leopard coexistence came up, and it ticked all the boxes. So yeah, I was very grateful to have the opportunity to get a little dip into social science.
and in South Africa, can you describe what the state of leopard human coexistence looked like from your research?
Yeah, so for my research specifically, there's been, I wouldn't say a lot because human wildlife coexistence, especially from the human dimension, is still quite a new-ish field. There's some stuff in it. Most of the stuff in with leopards in South Africa, in fact, I'd say almost all is to do with livestock loss, so about
Mm,
losing cattle and all that kind of stuff. Not cattle, sheep, yeah, livestock. For me, what was interesting about this was I was working with wildlife estates, which weren't to do with the typical livestock loss, but it was actually to do with residential areas and people who lived in these places. And what they were fearing with leopards was the loss of their pets. So, like cats and dogs
mm.
being taken by leopards, or themselves being hurt by leopards, or their small children being taken by leopards. So, it introduced a different level of fear in which a lot of my initial background research actually was done with the leopards in India because that's the only other
Mm.
really example of leopards and humans being in conflict rather than just the livestock was the urban leopards that exist in India. Yeah.
And then when you say wildlife estate, what exactly is that?
So wildlife estates, and there's many different kinds with different rules and regulations. I believe there's some in other parts of the world as well, but in South Africa specifically, it's normally a gated community, so like a secure residential development, and it's specifically in a bush environment, somewhere where people can have wildlife viewings and be in a natural environment, somewhere in the rural countryside, rather than being in a city secure environment. So
Mm.
it'll often have big fences around it to make it safe, and then yeah, residential plots, sometimes community facilities inside. So some have had schools in it, or they'll have like swimming pools, other things. So like a community that's secured and it'll be in nature. So they'll be in sometimes nature reserves or conservation areas. Like for me, my study was in the Greater Kruger area. So obviously, with the Kruger National Park nearby, there was a lot of wildlife in the area. And they have different rules. For example, some are herbivores only, so they'll only have deers, antelopes inside, whereas others will have lions and elephants walking through as well.
That's super interesting. I've never actually heard of something where you have such a curated experience of how you interact with wildlife, what animals are allowed in through that kind of barrier and the fencing. That's really interesting. And I guess like with leopards, it's also in South Africa that worry about harming pets and young children stuff. Is that an evidence backed worry, or do you find that it's more of, a big predator, you have that kind of instinctual fear for it?
Yeah, so I mean, the evidence for the fear exists in the sense of a leopard could definitely take down a child or dog. Like this
Mm-hmm.
is a capability of theirs 100%. In the same way that coyotes are a feared thing in America and stuff like that. And with the background research that I saw, leopards had taken small children, and dogs are about 20, 30 kilograms, which is exactly the weight that a leopard would go for when it comes to antelope. So anything around that size, a leopard will be able to take down. So, I mean, when I read some of the background research in India, it was clear that the human wildlife conflict in that region
Mm.
was there was evidence for it. And so if anyone reads that kind of stuff, then of course in South Africa, they're going to feel the same thing. The amount of cases that happen in terms of humans getting hurt in South Africa, I couldn't find much research on. There wasn't a lot of talk about it. There was attacks that have happened, say some people would be in tents in Kruger National Park and there'd be a hungry leopard that they thought was super skinny and was stalking them. So like that kind of fear does exist. There've been some people who've been attacked. I saw, I think, in like Zimbabwe and some of the other regions as well, but the research on it is low. So whereas in comparison, India had quite a lot of conflict studies, for example. So the fear is evident, but actually happening within the region, not that much. And then from my survey that I asked people, because I would ask people whether they themselves had gone through conflict or if they knew of people who'd gone through conflict. And still in these estates where the whole reason this topic came up is because people were scared in like Facebook group chats. They were kind of saying, oh, this leopard has been around, they're going to take my child, that kind of thing. When I actually did the research and asked how many people actually knew of something that had happened, the cases were very, very low, whereas in comparison to how often it was talked about was very, very high. So it seemed like the conflict, I think, from what I know of, at least like it was confirmed that 1 or 2 dogs had been taken. No children, no human instances had occurred, but I think 1 or 2 dogs had been taken, maybe a cat. And then that is what got people kind of going, oh, if they take a dog, then what's next? That could be my child next. I don't want my dog to be next. And so it became a bigger stir of conversation in comparison to the few instances that actually happened.
And then from gathering all this data and kind of making this analysis, and you said that you returned the research back to the communities. What did presenting the research look like? What kind of information were you giving them? And then what was their feedback and response?
Yeah, so the survey, I essentially got people's perceptions, attitudes, their behaviors, because I wanted to know like whether people were seeing conflict behavior. So in fact, for example, if people were seeing that people were constantly getting up close to leopards, or if people were letting their dogs run off leash, or if people were, leaving food out and that could bring leopards over. So if people were seeing that these behaviors were happening, that's an indicator to show why potentially these conflicts were happening as well, or why, leopards may be in the area as well. Aside from the fact that, having antelope in an enclosed area, even if they don't want leopards in that area, leopards can climb. And a fence, it's very hard for a fence to be able to stop a leopard. They'll crawl underneath, they'll get through. They're quite adaptable in that sense. And so it's hard to keep a leopard out. So them being there, and then some people, so I'd see their behaviors, what the residents were showing, and then also ask them what they wanted to do about the situation, whether people were wanting the leopards to be removed, what coexistence measures could we do, what education, what do they want, guidelines, reporting systems, that kind of stuff. So I gathered all this information. We got 167 responses from the 3 estates that I looked at. It's not necessarily representative of everybody because it was on a voluntary basis. So the loudest voices are going to be the ones that answer the survey. But it was interesting to see that from the survey of the loudest voices, about 66% said that they thought that there was coexistence in their communities. So majority of people viewed leopards positively and thought that the estate had coexistence with the leopards. The other options were 16% no conflict and 17% conflict. So we wanted to differentiate coexistence from no conflict because we wanted an understanding of whether there was simply a lack of conflict, so just nothing bad was happening, or whether people actually had a positive, mutually beneficial experience with leopards. So humans enjoying leopard sightings, then leopards being able to have that habitat connectivity with where the estates were. So I shared the presentation. I had a presentation for each estate and shared their individual results. I'm soon hoping to publish the results of this as a collective, but each of the estates got their individual results, and the feedback was quite interesting. Some people were a bit unsure of kind of, what the findings meant, because obviously it's a smaller sample, But
Mhm.
there was actually an overwhelmingly large amount of people who were curious, essentially, I'd say, is the feedback. They just wanted to know more. They wanted to know more about the leopard activity that was going on. They wanted to learn more about how they could protect themselves. There was a lot more communication about what can I do to keep myself safe rather than trying to change the leopard's behavior or wanting to take leopards away from the community. I think a lot of people from the survey we saw, people held leopards in a positive light. There was a national pride about them. And yeah, it was mainly about people were concerned about kids and like pets and their safety, but they wanted to know what they could do to help protect themselves. And then, yeah, I'd say it was a very positive response, actually, considering how much they wanted to work together and talk about the issue rather than just hating on things. And so, yeah, I do think there's definitely opportunity for education to be put in. One of the things that they mentioned was they think that there were luxury lodges in a lot of these residential plots. So you'll have guests that come over and tourists that come over to these regions who may not know the bush area as well, may not know how to interact with a leopard if they see one. And those were the ones where, when people were asked what they wanted to like say on this issue, they said those are the people that they're scared about, and those are the people that they think are, getting up close to leopards because they want a shot of a leopard with no understanding that the leopard is entirely capable of hurting them.
Mhm.
Yeah. And then what they want to do with that research, well, I've given them some management implications, for example, like that kind of newcomer safety briefings of the bush, education on encounters. People were also talking about more enforced pet management, so not letting dogs off lead and that kind of stuff. So there's that stuff that I've presented. Whether the management does anything about it is their own choice. But I've also, with this, because it was the first time anything like this has ever been done, no one's ever looked at the social science behind wildlife estates. So I've kind of given this set of questions now where if another conflict ever occurs, they can have these sets of questions that they can pull out of my very big survey, and do a big census and kind of see what everyone's opinion is on the issue and what decisions can come out of whatever conflicts occur.
Wow. That makes a lot of sense. And sometimes it's really shocking to me how much conservation throughout history has detached wildlife from the human experience, especially when that, just as you say, like the coexistence is so apparent, especially in places like India where you have we're living alongside wildlife in every step of the process. So it's really cool to kind of explore that path. And just to kind of come back to going into the social science angle of the research, was that a difficult decision for you? Is that something led by curiosity? Or, because I know some people, when you go into wildlife, you're thinking you're going to study, just as you said, animal behavior, lean into that. What was kind of your decision-making process of going more towards the human lens of things?
Yeah, so I think I had a very typical going into animal field where I was like, oh, the last thing I want to do is work with humans, so let's go work with animals. Because it's that whole like, one, I didn't want to work a job where I was sat in a boxed office building all day. That idea, I was always like, that's never going to be me. It's not always true. There's a lot of conservation jobs that definitely require that. But I was just very much like hospitality jobs, the idea of talking to people all the time. I was quite socially anxious as a kid, so I was very like, animals are my safe spot. I want to work with animals. That's why the whole zookeeper thing came into play. I think going into uni, that anxiety about people became a lot better because you're just forced to have to talk to people, and then learning, of course, about that conservation and animals, everything has to do with humans, because who's funding research if not humans? Who's going to give that public support if not humans? It's entirely the human population. Well, for us at least, we kind of decide a lot about what happens to animals. I mean, things will happen and evolve their own way as well, but humans have so much of an input, that if you don't kind of talk to politicians, talk to the funders and those kind of people, it just wouldn't work without human collaboration, essentially. And so I've actually always enjoyed human psychology. So, but that's from just kind of like observing people rather than having to go out and talk to them. And it was quite scary to me, the idea of, what if these people there's this idea of I come from a different place, right? I'm not South African. I haven't lived in a wildlife estate before. I'm not the one who has to live alongside a leopard, and I'm not the one who has to deal with a threat. So I felt a bit of imposter syndrome in the sense of like, who am I to do this research, right? Who am I to come to you and act like I can, not say what's best, but like it felt a bit like, I don't know what I'm talking about or that kind of thing. But then it's just the idea that the research and that data, I still know that best, because I collected it. And I'm not trying to tell you how to go about something. I'm just getting their voices and giving a microphone to their voices, right? Because the whole thing, there was talk of essentially with some of the leopards, whether they wanted to be removed. So whether we want to, kill the leopard or shoot the leopard in terms of darting them so that they would be removed to a different place. And so whether they wanted removal or destruction of the leopard, there was that kind of talk that was going on. From our surveys, we saw that most people didn't want that to happen, which is great. So yeah, with the fact that, leopards are obviously coming into this space, and then it's the humans who decide what happened to it, even though it's the humans who chose to go into that leopard's habitat for this wildlife experience in the first place. We need to know what these people think. And these people's voices, the public, are entirely what determines the future of this animal, right? Because the estate manager could easily just go, oh, this will happen. But if the residents have an opinion about it, I wanted to be able to give a microphone to that voice and let the people who were actually being impacted the most have an ability to have a say on what happens in their surroundings.
Yeah, and especially I think with community-oriented kind of politics and government, sometimes I think people forget the agency they have in their immediate locality. So it's really cool how by doing this research and searching out those voices, people can have opinions maybe that they didn't think that they had a space to put somewhere or to be heard or be useful. So I think that's really a cool approach. And also super interesting how you mentioned that very few things like what you're doing have been done before, but also how essential it is to ensuring the safety of the people and the leopards in tandem. So that's very interesting. Now, I'd like to shift from our predator of leopards to our good old beavers. Can you tell me a bit about your beaver project?
Yeah. So with the beavers, when I went to my university, I found out, I think within the first year or two, that there was this news article of, oh, beavers are moving to Nottingham. And I was just quite like, what? Why? Because it felt like, to me, I knew nothing. So I felt like, why are they adding this in my head? I think beaver, I think like the American beaver dam, that kind of stuff. So I was like, is there a need to have beavers in England? What is that? And then I did a bit of research on it and realized, oh, England used to have beavers, because they mentioned reintroduction, and I was used to an introduction. I'd never heard of reintroduction before, so I was just curious about that and realized that, oh, actually, yeah, beavers were always here in England. I learned a bit about their benefits and just kind of got to know the subject a bit and was like, oh, that's a really cool thing, and cool that they could benefit our landscape like that. At this point, it was still just an enclosed project. It wasn't legal to have wild beaver releases yet, but it was, I think, on the way, was what it seemed like. And then around when the externship was advertised, there was a lot of flooding that was happening in my local area, and I remembered hearing that beavers could actually help with that flooding because they help channel water essentially from the straight channels that humans have made them to be and make it a bit more wavy with those curbs and ebbs, and they make wetlands, and so they store water and stop it flooding into more straight channeled urban places. And so I was just kind of linking the things in my head a bit as a cool way that, and a more of a reason why beavers should be released into the wild. So when the conservation externship came about, I was like, well, I want to learn more about this subject. This would be a really, really cool opportunity to be able to delve into this. So that's why I chose it. And yeah.
So I'm curious. I have so many questions here. So firstly, one of my big thoughts about reintroductions of species is like, when is it appropriate and when is it not appropriate? So, like I think in India they're trying to bring back cheetahs, but at this point, every other predator has kind of already encapsulated that niche space that it once had, so then having a cheetah is senseless, especially for the cost of what it is. Or things like bringing back the dire wolf, or all those, or I don't think there's bringing back. Isn't that like a Game of Thrones thing? No,
No,
but
they made direwolf
yeah,
puppies or something. That was a big thing, yeah.
yeah, making dire wolves, whatever under sun, bringing back mammoths or something. What are, I guess, the reasons for, and if there are reasons against, beaver reintroduction into the UK?
Yeah, so for England specifically, this was a heavily debated thing. I think Scotland had the same thing, but Scotland was a bit faster about it. Essentially, yeah, reintroduction and rewilding is a hugely debated topic. There's just so many concerns that have to be brought about, especially if you're reintroducing a completely new species. Whereas it's a bit different in England, I guess, because beavers did exist here before, so we know at some point in time this was their landscape. It's not like they never belonged here, which I guess is the same for the cheetahs in India. But of course, we don't live in the past anymore. The landscape has changed immensely since I think beavers went extinct in the 16th century, so around the 1300s for England, and 1500s for Scotland, I believe. So it's a very different landscape from when beavers went extinct. There's a lot more urban environments now in England. And I mean, for example, there's been talk of wolves being reintroduced into the UK, which in my opinion is an unrealistic ask, because wolves, they hunt in packs and they require a lot of space, and it's just space that we don't have in England. In Scotland, maybe. I don't know too much about that landscape, but with England specifically, there's just no way I can't see a way in which we have any space for that. Whereas with beavers, for example, because they would live in the riverways and stuff, and because of the flooding impacts that England has. So England already in itself, I think from the research that I did, there's something about £1 million, maybe more, that's spent on flooding mitigation per year. And people were already using beavers in Europe, when beavers went extinct. Europe began reintroducing them because, I mean, they were going pretty extinct in Europe as well until the 1900s. But then when people realized this whole species was about to go extinct, and I think in the 1900s, we started having a bit more of this conservation thought process in comparison to the hunting that was happening before. So the reintroduction across Europe went very well. And there was, beavers that were in German cities that were helping to stop flooding mitigation, like being flooding mitigations basically, and stopping flooding from happening in German cities. And so all this was kind of fed back into the UK. And it was just a bit, with all this £1 million spent on flooding mitigations, and the mitigations that we were doing were essentially creating leaky dams. So creating dams with holes in them, essentially being what a beaver dam would be. So a lot of people were just kind of a bit like, why are we spending all this money when we could have a species that was kind of always supposed to be here doing it for free? And so in Scotland, I believe there was beavers that showed up in the River Tay of unknown origin, whether it was an unauthorized release or an escaped beaver from a project or something like that. But they were causing a bit of trouble, and they were flooding farmlands essentially, I think. And so farmers were shooting them, and at first that's kind of how it was allowed, is that there was like a hunting license, I believe, and you could shoot a number of beavers or something like that. And then eventually it was just decided that we need to move the beavers from this place. And so when it comes to reintroduction, it has to be very, very thought out, because otherwise you get those conflict incidences, right? And then, so they moved them to Knapdale, and they had the Scottish beaver trial, which happened for about 5 years, 2009 to 2014. And that actually showed that there was tons of positive ecological impacts for beavers being in the area. It just had to be planned out so that they weren't going to go down a catchment and go and flood a farmland, essentially. And then around 2014, beavers were found in Devon, so this is England now. And again, unknown origin, whether it was what we call beaver bombers, which was people that just put beavers out unlicensed. So yeah, the government were going to take them away because it was unregulated and not allowed, but the public were very unhappy about that, and it turned out that the beavers might have been there since maybe as early as 2008 or something like that, and that everyone had just kind of been keeping it quiet because they liked it. And so then came the Devon beaver trial, which was between 2015 and 2020, to look at whether there was positives towards beavers being in the wild in the UK, and that also had a bunch of like successful evidence towards it. And with all the other enclosed beaver projects, because people were bringing in beavers to help with their wetland restoration, which was what was happening in Nottingham. They have a big lake, essentially, and the beavers were just helping them. Essentially what happens is because of the way that we've constructed the landscape, there's an overpopulation of certain species. You know, we don't have the same deer that we did before, and so they're not eating the same stuff. These beavers were essentially able to get rid of a lot of this over vegetation and do the work that tons and tons of conservation workers were spending all their time and labor doing anyways. And so it was just a much more efficient method and natural method. And so with all of this positive evidence, I think that's where it kind of led to the legislation eventually being passed, because it just felt a bit like there's a lot of positives. The negatives do exist in terms of farmland could potentially be flooded, but that's where all this planning, like meticulous planning, comes into play. And things like, I think some people were worried about diseases, potential diseases with reintroducing species is a big thing. And I think they've passed all that kind of stuff with the beavers in Scotland. It was all fine, and they've done all the checks in England. It doesn't seem like they would bring anything new to the environment that we don't have already. And so yeah, those are the kind of safety checks that go through. There's a lot of processing. I think in 2020 was when the trial finished, and it was kind of decided that beavers were a good thing, but they still didn't actually have that wild license release legislation put into place until 2025. So it still took about 5 years of, figuring this stuff out. So it definitely isn't a simple process of, oh, this animal looks cool. With the direwolf situation, that isn't a reintroduction thing. That was just, for science sake, I guess, a cool thing to try. But for example, with the cheetahs in India, or that kind of stuff where it's a bit like, well, how much is it up against, right? And how much can you give? What are the benefits that I could actually give? Are you bringing cheetahs into India because there really is a need for a predator to be in that space? There's this need for this animal to be there, or is it, it'd be cool to have a cheetah here kind of thing, right? And so for England, it was the benefits outweighed the negatives, essentially, because that flooding mitigation was such a cost for us that they could benefit. And if we planned it right, so that farmland wasn't affected, then these coexistence measures could be mitigated, and we could all mutually benefit from this. The beavers could have a place, and nature could make our strait channels a bit more wavy, stop flooding happening. It was a mutually beneficial decision, essentially.
And for the reintroduced beavers, the ones that are licensed to be released, where are they coming from? So the ones in Nottingham that were in the enclosed projects, they were actually rescued from the River Tay in Scotland, where they were being shot, because that was an unplanned place and not a good place for them, essentially. So where those ones come from, I believe, from what the genetics say, a lot of them are Norwegian beavers. Okay. So the Eurasian beaver didn't go extinct. They were like super, super small, almost extinct, isolated populations that existed. So the Eurasian beaver wasn't recreated. But yeah, I believe the ones that are in the UK, some of them are come from Norway. And there's other parts in Europe that they'll be coming from, essentially, yeah. A lot of the English ones currently are from Scotland, from that, I think, the River Tay was a thing that needed
a big group that need to be moved around. So a lot of the enclosed projects have river tay rescues, and it will be a lot of the enclosed projects that have been planning their licensing to have this wild release for a long time now. They just need the legislation to go through. So now that the legislation is, I mean, I'm seeing tons of job offers for beaver species recovery managers and stuff like that. So it was just
Wow.
it was just as simple as, well, not as simple, but it was just we need this to go through, and then all this licensing gets through, and the beavers that we have, I guess they're now Scottish beavers to us, will be put into England. Yeah.
Oh, okay. And then the second part of, in addition to the research, you also produced the film as well, starting with seed funding from post the externship. Why did you decide to pursue a film?
So like I said in the beginning, growing up on David Attenborough documentaries essentially, and you know, I loved nature because I was in it, but seeing what I saw on screen definitely, it's that typical childhood dream of, oh, that exotic place looks super, super cool. Being in my degree, I learned a lot more about what was locally around me and the cool animals and ecosystems and nature that actually was right on my doorstep. But having this seed funding, I knew I could have potentially pursued a research project, but with the fact that so much research had already been done on beaver reintroductions, because there was this huge movement for it, it felt like what was needed was more advocacy towards having the legislation be passed. Because at the time, it was 2024. So at the time, when I was creating the documentary, the legislation hadn't been passed yet. So it was still, hey guys, let's, get the government to understand that this is a good thing to happen, and that we want beavers in our area. So yeah, I thought, when else in my life am I going to be able to make a wildlife documentary that's, because to do it by myself, it would take a lot of funding from me that I didn't have. And there was now this funding that I could have to have advocacy. And my sister is studying film. So I just felt like, I already have someone who has that experience. It would be super cool to kind of do like a sister project, have her be the cinematographer and me be the researcher, and just, do a wildlife documentary with my sister, essentially.
That's super cool, and a good way to bring you and your sister together as well. I'm curious specifically about filming beavers, if that was more your sister, but like what was that process like? And I'm in terms of behavior, how, I guess, shy or humanized the beavers are to people's presence.
So because we were in Nottingham and we wanted to have a local angle to it, but we also definitely wanted to get the wild beavers on camera as well. The people in Nottingham said that it would be very hard to get footage of the beavers in those enclosures, just because it was a huge, huge place. And so we were like, okay, let's focus on the wild beavers in Devon, because we'd seen photographers who'd gotten shots of them, so we know that at least somebody knows where they are. And so we got in touch with a photographer there, and she was also a local tour guide there for beavers, which was crazy. I didn't know that beaver tour guides was a thing. And I mean, considering I'd only learned that beavers were in the UK like 2 years ago, but it was, so she gave us, like, I tried to search it around for myself, but I was just, let's get it from a professional. She gave us a location, and so we went down to Devon. It was me and my sister. We went down to Devon to try and find these beavers. From the research, I knew that they were awake at dusk and dawn, so I wouldn't be able to film them during the day. And from my research, it basically meant that we had to wake up at 3 a.m. to try and catch the beavers at dawn, which was hard to get up at that time, but we did it. And we went to the location. We found a beaver lodge, which is their homes. They're like mud huts of sticks and stuff. And I was like, okay, let's kind of sit by and just watch and see what happens. And like our tour guide, I think, was going to have our session with us tomorrow. So I was just, and it was an evening one. So I was just we only had a week there. I was just trying to make as much time as possible to get as much footage as possible, because wildlife is unpredictable and you do not know when things will appear, if we were going to get any footage at all. And we were lucky enough, I think we were sat for 15 minutes and we saw our first beaver. And it was the first one like either of us had ever seen, so we were just in awe and super, super happy with ourselves. And then 5 minutes later, the tiniest little baby beaver came out of this lodge, and we were ecstatic. I mean, we were happy enough that we were like able to get a shot of a beaver, let alone the baby. We were not expecting a baby. So super, super cool. And super good that we got up at dawn, because our evening sessions, when we went back in the evening to try and catch shots of them, the baby never came out in the evening, only at dawn. So it was good that we decided to take that approach. And we managed to get shots of the baby and beavers. I think we were there for 4 days in total, shooting every day. And even then, with dusk and dawn filming, I think we were filming maybe 2 to 3 hours at each time. The actual usable beaver footage that we got ended up only being about 4 minutes.
Wow.
We have some really good shots of them, but they disappear completely into the water. If their head is not above water, you wouldn't know that they're there, or if they're not dragging a stick. In terms of humanization, there were people who were definitely looking out for these beavers. In dawn, not so much, but at dusk, you would get the wildlife photographers, and there would be public who were walking, and I'd ask them, oh, is this your first time? Did you come to see them for one time? And they're like, no, I live in the local area. I always check up on them. Like, I love them. Like, it was cool to see that the public actually really enjoyed their presence. And so I think the beavers must be, to an extent, used to the noise, because there's, at least 4 or 5 people near them. Not super close, but, they know that they're there and they just continue going about their thing. If a lot of people come, they do kind of go away. So they're not tame for sure, but they're used to the attention, I guess. I don't see any negatives to it, except, again, the baby. I believe the reason the baby doesn't come out in the evenings is because that's when more people come out. So the baby doesn't come out in the evenings. But yeah, but I'd say this group, from what the tour guide said, she'd been following this one beaver for, I want to say, I can't remember how many years, but a long time. She'd watched this beaver have another set of kits as well. And so she felt that, yeah, this beaver doesn't care so much about people because she'd been around people so much. But if it was to be reintroductions of other beavers, especially, for example, the Nottingham ones, they're not used to people at all. So it would be an entirely different thing, as well as the fact that researchers were heavily around these particular group of beavers for those 5 years. So I'd say even though these beavers have a level of humanization, the reintroduced ones definitely, I don't think, would have the same.
Okay. And through the process of filming and putting together the documentary, was there anything new that you learned through that process that is different from your regular research and other approaches to conservation that you've been involved with?
So putting together, yeah, it was an entirely new field for me. I think for my sister as well, it was her first big documentary. I mean, she'd only filmed like 2-minute pieces before, and we were trying to get it to 20 minutes, but 30 minutes is what we got. But yeah, it was our first time doing anything like this. And I'm a researcher. I studied a science degree, so I come about it. I'm used to writing lab reports and research reports. So I think the way I present things could come off like that. I remember when I wrote my story map, I was a bit, this is long-winded and a bit scientific, and I tried to be layman, but I lacked a bit of that. I lacked a bit of that artistic communication, I guess. And I relied a bit more on my sister for that kind of artistic style. The editing process was probably the hardest part and super long-winded, because initially our direction was for advocacy, but I mean, I think right after we finished logging all the rushes and tidying everything, and just as we were about to start sequencing deciding the editing structure and stuff, we got the news that the legislation had been passed. And it
Oh.
was, yeah, so it was actually super lucky because we hadn't gotten really into the dirt of like editing just yet, but
Hmm.
it spinned everything basically because we were trying to get that legislation pushed, and now it passed. So super cool, good news in total. But now the direction of the documentary was a bit, where do we go from here? So I kind of spun it and was like, well, I still bet a ton of people have no idea that this happened and why it happened at all. So instead of advocacy, we turn to awareness. So this film then becomes a, hey, if anyone's curious as to why beavers are coming in to the UK, to England, then here's a bit of history as to what happened before, what happened in Europe and Scotland, that kind of stuff. And here's all the benefits that they can bring if they come into this area, as well as if anyone's got these fears, then here's some of the ways that we can mitigate those fears. Yeah, so it became awareness and learning to communicate in that kind of way versus a written report was a learning process for me. And I still think now that I look back at it, it feels again quite long-winded and sciencey because that's just how my take tends to be.
Hmm.
But it helped me learn a lot about that need to really, yeah, kind of get to what people are going to want that information the most, what information people want the most, which is, soothing those fears and knowing how to move forward with the coexistence measures and also why they're here, all those benefits, and making that less long-winded and scientifically detailed.
Yeah. It was also interesting while watching your film, the one person you interviewed kind of saying how the misconceptions around beavers of like eating fish or like eating trees, but specifically what parts of the trees. And I also learned quite a bit about kind of even those small fears that you think of, any irrationality of kind of why you wouldn't want a beaver, like they're going to cut down all the trees or something. Was it was good to kind of hear those the real truth about it. Especially the fish one was interesting. I don't think I've ever thought of a beaver eating fish, but that was interesting that that would be an assumption people would have. So that was cool as well. It was a very beautiful film as well. The footage of the
Thank
beavers
you.
that you did manage to capture, I was just like insane. I That's magical, so magical. Now we can head into our special mini segment of the episode, conservation hot takes. So in this segment, we want to know one of your conservation hot takes, something someone will disagree with. So Eleanor, what is your conservation hot take for today?
Yeah, so I think we've kind of been talking about this as well, and you brought it up with that whole rewilding and reintroduction thing. For me, and particularly because I've been looking quite into human wildlife coexistence in both of these projects, um, I think I think we're moving more towards this now, but in the past, or still in some places, there's this, I think, thought that nature and wildlife and animals is separate from the human
Mm-hmm.
experience. So, with rewilding, for example, what I said with the wolves, like some people are like, oh, how cool would it be to have all of those old creatures back, and have that wild, pristine, natural environment. When to me, the reality is just, how are we ever going to have that back? Because, I mean, we don't have the space. Humans are not going to start giving up that space. There's that whole debate of, we can protect this area of land, but then how many houses could that have been for the homeless, for example? Or, you protect this forest, but how many of those indigenous people are using the resources in that forest, using that wood? And so this idea that nature and animals only exist in this reserve and it's separate and a different place than humans in this city or this residential area. I think there needs to be a lot more focus on the integration of nature and humans. The fact of the matter is that humans are not going to go away. We are going to probably keep going into habitats as much as we want to protect them. And whilst I think it's definitely important for the animals that can't adapt to the human experience to have some of those protected areas, I think there needs to be this focus on urban adaptations and how animals are actually evolving alongside us to live with us because we are dominating so much of the planet. So like, for example, the idea that pigeons have darker pigmentation in order to help with the metal that exists in cities. So they're able to live better in cities because melanin ions attach better with metal ions, so their immune system doesn't have to take on so much of that, like lead poisoning, for example, or zinc that was happening in Paris and stuff like that. So just pigeons have been with us for a long time and they've evolved alongside us. Or for example, lizards that have learned to be stickier and stick to concrete rather than their original, woody textures and stuff like that. And just this idea that the animals are learning to evolve alongside us. It isn't a separate animals live there and humans live here. We do live alongside each other whether we like it or not. And the only way to go forward and be sustainable is to continue to learn how we can tolerate each other and whether we can mutually benefit from each other. Learning about how beavers can benefit us, learning about, the fact that it's not just humans doing things for nature for the sake of protecting nature, but that humans need nature. The resources, so many of the resources we have come from nature. Something as important as an earthworm that fertilizes the soil, that gives us crops, that gives us our food. Everything is interlinked. And so I think, it's been happening with this raccoons, foxes, bear proofing bins, is a big thing because we are learning that some creatures do benefit from living around humans for this reason. And I think, there just needs to be more of a integrated approach when it comes to conservation. Of course, I think it's important still to have those protected areas and those, individual species that are super important. But for example, I guess another hot take, but like pandas would have died without us, in my opinion. And the same for even cheetahs. Their numbers aren't super, super low, but they're such a niche population. They're such a niche species. And I think without some of the human help, they wouldn't last too long. They're not super, super adaptable. And there's some national pride that comes with these creatures, of course, and I think that's important. But I think it's important to look at how the animals have been adapting to our urban areas even more. Like leopards are extremely adaptable creatures, the way that they can go into the urban environments of India. I mean, leopards across Asia and Africa, you see them across so many different habitats. And so this is a creature that we know is here to stay and will work very well within our environments, whether we like it or not. And so we need to learn how to live alongside them and how to tolerate them. And for example, with reintroducing species, like reintroducing wolves to the UK is a bit, the land space just isn't there. But we need predators because we killed them all. So the compromise there is lynxes are a new topic of conversation about being reintroduced. And lynxes is a great compromise because they're a predator, but they work solitary, so we don't have to deal with huge packs of wolves that would need that space. Even though they have big territories, they can sneak around themselves a lot more unnoticed. They're more secretive. And so just this idea of compromising the human and animal experience as the interlinked ecosystem that it is.
Yeah, I think that's super important, and I sit on a very similar spectrum. I think one of the tension points that I have within myself of how to communicate this is like I want people to understand that in their urban or suburban or whatever locality that they're existing is, just as you say, nature is all around us, it's here to stay, and there should be some facilitation to encourage that interaction. And also, I would also say, embrace the magic rather than prioritizing the exotic, I think, because there will be this push from, like in the US, we will want to preserve elephants, tigers, this kind of charismatic fauna. But then, like just as you're saying, we're not living in the backyards with leopards who could cross through, or tigers that could come through as well. That I think we should also recognize, like simple things that we would pass off as simple, like a squirrel or rabbits or deer, or luckily I live near black bears, which is awesome. Things like that, just kind of also recognizing how beautiful that our own ecosystem is. But then at the same time, my other crux is like, okay, one of my thoughts is I've been thinking a lot about this population of monkeys in a small village in India that I visited. The most beautiful monkeys I've ever seen, I will tell you. They have like this beautiful black mane. They're called the lion-tailed macaque. I'm not sure, but they have this. Oh, it's just gorgeous. But they're arboreal, so they spend all their time in the trees mostly. But then because of deforestation for tea plantations and forest fragmentation and everything, their population, they've been endangered since the 1970s, and their population is around like 2,500 in the wild period. But then some of them are kind of adapting or adjusting their behavior to come down and then be more amongst the tea fields and in the village and stuff. And just as you say, like, it's important to see that kind of ability to function in that ecosystem, but at the same time in the human kind of dominated space. But at the same time, I worry to give this like false sense of confidence to people that just because they can make adjustments doesn't mean that they should, and we should still be putting those efforts to connecting forests where we can, obviously not trying to force like instability and mass movement of people because we're making a national park or something. I don't agree with that, but in having some kind of, just as you say, that blend of we need to protect the natural spaces that we still have remaining while also acknowledging how we can mutually exist at those interfaces where they are forced to happen.
Yeah, that thing you said about the monkeys evolving to it, like, I think that stuff is super interesting, but I agree with you. It's like, you don't want to tell people that just because nature is adapting to humans means, oh, it's all good, then we can do whatever we want, because they'll just, adapt to us. Because, it's like, whilst, yeah, sometimes I think some people would be like, oh, it's hard, for example, with the pigeons and metal ions, right? Oh, what a horrible thing that we're detrimenting pigeons in this way. And yes, it's not great that that's happening. But on the other hand, they've continued to live pretty well. And they've made this adaptation, which is really cool that they can do that. But in the same aspect, it's like, this does affect our ecosystem. For example, if the birds eat the snails that have pesticides in them, and if we eat the birds that have pesticides in them, then we continue, this thing of like, yes, it's cool that they can adapt and live by us, but we also then accumulate that negative. In the same way, we'll have microplastics in us because that's what we decided to do to us, and that's what we're doing to nature as well. There's always that effect, and just because we can adapt to, live with microplastics doesn't mean that it's the greatest idea. But I also think it shouldn't always be shunned as a huge negative when a human has had an impact on animals. Like the idea that urban foxes and rural foxes are almost entirely different in how they, well, not entirely different, but there's strong differences between how they act, and they could be considered to an extent different species, but they are the same species, but they have different brains and how they go about their life because of the different challenges that come with urban living. Even something as simple as, I read something about squirrels having darker pigmentation because they kept being run over on roads. And so if they had darker pigmentation, they would survive being roadkill. And just small things like that, where that isn't detrimenting an animal hugely, but it allows them to live alongside us. And that kind of research helps us understand, okay, these are the animals that can adapt well with us. These are the ways that we see that adaptations work. Let's look at as well the ways that adaptation doesn't work, and which animals aren't going to be able to adapt as well to us because of their certain niches, like cheetahs are basically good at being fast and that's it. So like those kind of things, and we then decide with our limited funding and support that we do have where we want to put our resources towards, like there's a lot of resources going towards protecting cheetahs, and whilst I love cheetahs. It's this idea of that animal is serving a great national pride and function, but is this funding perhaps better gone towards, protecting an ecosystem versus a species, right? There's that whole argument as
Yeah.
well. But yeah, entirely, I think we have to think about the fact that humans are here to stay, and habitat destruction is definitely something that is happening, and it's horrible, but it will continue to happen, unfortunately. And it's just about how do we make it so that the habitat, rather than being completely destroyed, right? Rather than being completely destroying a habitat and not letting animals into this place at all, how do we allow animals to move through this place that we also want to have access to?
Exactly. Well, I think that's a great place to kind of wrap up this episode. So much more stuff I'd want to dig into, but hopefully we'll have a future chance with Eleanor on this podcast actually to talk about stuff like that. But thank you so much, Eleanor, for coming on today. I learned so much from the conversation about beavers, leopards in South Africa, so many good things. I'm curious if there is a way that people can reach out to you, if they're curious to learn more, where can they do so?
So I'd say for this kind of stuff, the best place to reach me is on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on there. If you just search Eleanor Salisbury on LinkedIn. I have my beaver documentary out on YouTube if anyone wants to watch it. It's called Hope for Our Rivers. I believe it's actually under my sister's account, Abigail Salisbury. But mainly LinkedIn is where I've been posting a lot of this conservation related stuff. Whether there's anything in the future, I don't know, but at the moment, LinkedIn is the best place to reach out to me.
Perfect. And her LinkedIn and the documentary will be in the show notes link, so you can visit that as well. I highly recommend watching it. I enjoyed it very much. So Eleanor, if you have any final words to say, this is your chance to speak them if you have it.
I mean, to me, all I care about is getting people out into nature. And everyone says touch grass, and of course it's important to touch grass, but instead of just, passively walking outside, I want people to kind of think about the interconnectedness of everything, and the fact that the soil underneath your floor serves a purpose, and the animals that live in it. And if you're taking a walk by a tree, actually take a close look at that tree, and you'll see that there's a whole nother ecosystem just in this small environment, and there's nature everywhere you look. There's spiders in your house for a reason. They're eating something. So yeah, they're always living with you, and the more we learn about why they live amongst us and how they can live amongst us, the better our future will be.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Eleanor, again for being on the podcast. And thank you all for listening to this episode of Resilience Tracks. We'll see you in a couple weeks for another episode. Thank you.
Thank you.